Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I wanted to talk about something that has been on my mind for a while, but I haven't really been able to properly put into terms until I watched a recent video by your boy Zack, where he commented on how what he referred to as atheism had left modern storytelling very impoverished. And I think that's really a pretty unfair characterization. I'm going to link Zach's video down in the description below, and you can watch it. I don't intend to do much to recap it here. So if you haven't seen it and you need some context, definitely watch that. The general thrust of his video is that before atheism became the mainstream in the culture, people drew very heavily on a very broad array of cultural influences to tell stories. And Zach has hit on a very interesting idea here. But I think he's off base. I think he's made a very unfair comparison. The idea that Zach has hit upon is what is called in classical theory the Great Conversation. The Great Conversation is a theory that states that all artists, all writers, all painters, all poets, anyone who partakes in the creation of some kind of art is trying to convey a truth about humanity to other people. And even if that humanity is as simple as enjoying the view of a haystack in the middle of the French countryside, and the simple pleasure of seeing that at different times of the day, we are still sharing some part of the human experience with one another. And when that is the underpinning idea of art, all artists then are not only speaking to their own experience, they are trying to speak to ideas that other artists have codified, going all the way back to the Iliad and the Odyssey and the great classical works of Greek and Roman literature to the present day. It is these allusions, with an A, not an I, that Zach is referring to when he talks about the drawing of heavy inspiration from Greek mythology or Roman mythology or Norse mythology. It is the attempt to synthesize the truths in there, to strip out the cultural trappings and the mistakes that are made in there, and represent them to a modern era with the own spin of the artist and with new insights from the modern era that makes up the give and take, the speaking and response of the Great Conversation. This has been an idea understood in literature and art for a very long time, but it is also an idea that has fallen out of fashion. What has come up to replace it is called critical theory. And I'm not going to get too deeply into critical theory or its origins. However, the core idea of critical theory is important to understanding why, when the Great Conversation moved out, we did not get something that filled the same role in our understanding of art. The basic tenet of critical theory states that art is not a means to convey truth, but rather a means to convey control. All critical theory looks at art as a framework to impose something on people rather than a medium to share something. This means that artist and audience are automatically at odds in the framework of critical theory because the artist is attempting to impose something on the people who are viewing the art. The purpose of critical theory is to introduce a new class of people, critics, who apply quote-unquote critical thinking to art in an attempt to break down what the controls that the artist is putting in their art are, and then remove them. Now, I understand why Zach presents this as an outgrowth of atheism. Since the introduction of the scientific method and the incredible analytical power of that kind of objectivity and experimentation-driven way of looking at the world, everyone has tried to apply the scientific method to everything. The problem is there are many things that you cannot apply an experimental, objective method of viewing the world to. One of them is other people. You cannot treat as an object something with the same level of agency as yourself. Even if you do manage to somehow completely objectively look at one person, you cannot then repeat that experiment to establish repeatability because you're either working with the same person who's going to approach your experiment with previous knowledge of it, or a different person who is not interchangeable with the first person you use, no matter how many controls you try and put in place. And yet proponents of critical theory seem to believe this is possible. They seem to think that you can unplug an audience or an author from a work of art and plug yourself in, and then analyze it critically from your own point of view. That's true to an extent, and in fact, a lot of modern criticism of media, a lot of film critics, a lot of book reviewers, this is exactly what they do, and they do produce somewhat useful insights into a piece of art, because after all, art is supposed to make sense to people approaching it from a different point of view. The problem is, a critical theorist does not allow for any conversation at all. There is no outside influence. There is no outside intention. There is only the viewpoint of the person who comes to the work. When you cut off all of that outside influence, then you cut off the conversation, the give and take, the speaking and the response, that it is an inherent part of art. That is incredibly critical in any kind of art, but it is particularly impactful in extremely distilled, compact forms of art, such as a song, which is only a couple of minutes long and has to convey a lot of information in order to get the kind of responses they want in the lyrics. Another example is comics. They don't have a lot of pages to work with in each installment. They have to do a lot of their storytelling visually. They rely heavily on symbolism and subtext and the greater cultural context that people bring to their story. When the critical theorist tries to boil down a story into interchangeable parts, when it tries to unplug people and plug in new people, or unplug points of view and plug in new points of view, they miss the entire conversational part of storytelling and art. And that is particularly devastating to mediums like popular music, which has lyrics that need to, again, be very condensed in their imagery and in their symbolism, and also in comics, which have to be incredibly condensed. And then you start to see it, I think, in shorter TV shows, half-hour-long TV shows. They don't have a whole lot of real estate there either. Maybe 20 minutes of actual storytelling in which to condense a story. And then it spreads out to hour-length TV shows, and then movies, and eventually your entire culture is locked in this very interchangeable parts-driven, very critical narrative-driven, quote-unquote, art that doesn't really do, in my opinion, what great art is supposed to do and engage in that great conversation about human ideas and their implications for other people and how well they function or do not function and what the difficulties they face are. Because every idea you present, every situation you present can only be looked at through the point of view of the person who comes to it. The brilliant thing about the great conversation is it did not matter what your first introduction to it was. Maybe you read a Thor comic and you were first introduced to the ideas of the Norse gods there. Well, then you can enter the great conversation through that avenue. Maybe you read the Iliad in high school and you were really interested and you were introduced to the works of the classics in that way, and you enter the great conversation there. Just because you read these works of arts and you don't instantly understand all the subtleties and the allusions and the depth of the great conversation that is running through them doesn't make the great conversation invalid. You can enter it from any point and really, really benefit from exploring that conversation from that point. And comics really need this because, again, comics, to start with, have, at least in America, always been a highly interconnected medium. That's one of their weaknesses, but it can also be one of their strengths. Understanding the necessity of digging through a lot of lore in order to completely understand a situation that is going on is an inherent part of the great conversation and an inherent part of engaging with American comics. At the same time, you need to present a story that it is self-contained and intelligible on its own so that people will be able to come away from the story and say, oh, I understand that, but there's this one piece that I need more insight into. And then that becomes what drives people towards the great conversation. And I don't think that the modern comic book industry tries to do either of those things. They don't try and present self-contained stories, and they don't try and include allusions that drive people towards that greater conversation, because I don't believe they think it's possible. And I think that's why Zack sees the medium as so impoverished, not necessarily because of atheism, because many atheists and even the anti-theists were engaged in that great conversation. They were at many times trying to rebut parts of it, but that's fine. People who have contributed to the conversation have always tried to rebut each other. No, if anything, atheism glorified science to such an extreme degree that people then attempted to use it in ways that are not really entirely applicable. Yes, you can gain insight into a work of art by trying to look at it objectively. You can analyze techniques and break them down and try and understand those as well. However, you cannot just view a work of art that way. And it is as atheism pushed very hard to make this objective experimental way of knowing our only way of knowing, or at least our primary socially acceptable way of knowing and sharing information, then yes, we did start to have this rise in critical theory that cut off the great conversation. But it is not an outgrowth of atheism itself. Rather, it is an outgrowth of an over-reliance on objectivism and of experimentation as ways of knowing, which has happened in plenty of philosophies outside of atheism. What is very encouraging is that comics has always had to be a very heavily reliant medium on this kind of great conversation mentality. As Zack himself referred to, Jack Kirby drew heavily on mythology, and so did a lot of the other writers. Stan Lee, of course, wanted to be a novelist, and he included a lot of literary allusions in his own work. In the modern day, as you can see from this image on the screen, we have people like Narwhal who are going back and mining classical films like Nosferatu as inspiration for comics as well. Whether it be film, whether it be novels, whether it be the classical works of tragedy and comedy, comics are always going to draw heavily on the great conversation so that they can tell their stories as compactly and efficiently as possible. But it's important not to cut off parts of that conversation. And again, I think atheists have contributed to that conversation in their own right, bringing their own interesting ideas to the table. Now, anyone who has watched my channel for a while knows that this isn't a defense of atheism. I think atheism is philosophically kind of silly. But they do have a lot to offer, and reading that is illuminating and useful, just as reading any other part of the great conversation, no matter how off base it is, can be illuminating and helpful if you approach it from the right point of view. Anyway, I'm not trying to take Zack to task here. I know he tends to speak off the cuff and in very broad generalizations. I just thought it would be useful to look at this idea a little more carefully and remind people this great conversation is a part of our culture that goes back over 2,000 years. It is very important to pay attention to it and to make it a part of your analytical process and your creative process. Anyways, that's all I've got for you today. There's a like button and subscribe button down below. You can use those as you see fit, and I will talk to you